make it yourselfers and carnivores. Today I'm going to share a family favorite recipe that we've been making well over a decade now. The way we have made this recipe has changed quite a bit over the years. I have experimented a lot with this recipe, but we continue to make it a lot. Even my 14-year-old son, who is quite picky and who was even pickier when he was younger, has always loved this recipe. These are a slow cooker carnita. Carnitas means little meats in Spanish. De carne, which is meat, and ita, when you add that to the end, it makes it kind of diminutive or little. Carnitas are generally made with pork. In this case, I am going to be using a pork shoulder. I can find this here in Spain. It is called cabeza de lomo here, and it's quite a large piece. And I like to use the whole piece and cook it all at once because I can save a lot of time and energy by doing it that way. This is one of those recipes that you can make ahead and it freezes wonderfully. So what I like to do is I will make the large piece, the piece that I buy. It just fits perfectly into my slow cooker. I have a pretty large slow cooker. And I will cook it and then divide it up for another week. Most of the pieces I find here are at least 2.5 kilograms, so that is over 5 pounds. If you're trying to calculate the amount of meat you'll need for a certain number of people though, consider that generally you would use about 1/3 of a pound to 1/2 of a pound for a normal meal for a normal person. Now, if you are eating a meat-based diet, and this is going to be the only thing you are eating at the meal, and especially if you're doing 1 meal a day or something like that, you're probably going to eat a lot more than that. So this is just a general guideline for just a general meal where you are wrapping it up and maybe serving it with some sort of side. So you want to calculate accordingly to what you think you'll be using. What you can use is generally called a pork shoulder in the United States, I think, and I'm not sure about other countries. I've also seen people say that you can buy what is called the Boston butt, or it's sometimes called the pork butt. And that is generally a part of the larger piece of the pork shoulder. And any of those pieces are good for using. I like buying pieces that are well marbled with fat throughout. These pieces get really tender and break up into nice smaller pieces of meat. If you just have a very muscle heavy piece of meat, it will just tend to be drier and just won't get as tender. Generally, these cuts are going to be already well marbled with the fat. But that's why you want to choose these sorts of cuts. You don't want to use like a pork loin, which is going to be on the drier side. This is one of those recipes that you want to start early in the day and get it ready for dinner. I like to make it 8 hours ahead at least. I cook this on the low setting for my slow cooker, and 8 hours is just about perfect with my slow cooker to get meat that falls apart and breaks apart really easily with a fork. You're going to want to try this out with whatever slow cooker you have at home, and just make sure that you leave yourself enough time if this is the first time you are making it. Because if your slow cooker needs to cook it a little bit longer, you just want to really make sure that your meat is nice and tender by the time you later are going to crisp it up. I'm going to be talking about that in a second. One of the things that people love about carnitas is that it has this really tender meat, but on the other hand, you're playing with two different textures. Usually people will crisp them up at the last minute before serving them by frying them in a bit of lard or bacon fat, and that will just give you that different play in textures. You have the brown crispy meat that just pairs so well with the rest that is nice and tender and moist. If you're following a strict carnivore diet, you do not have to use any spices. You can use just the meat and salt, and we used to do this all the time. In fact, when I first published this post about 10 years ago, this was one of my first recipe posts. I didn't know what I was doing, and all I basically said was throw the meat in the slow cooker with a little bit of salt and cook it, and then I showed how to make some corn tortillas to go with it. These days, I do not make the corn tortillas anymore. For a while, I was making some paleo pitas made with tapioca starch. And later on, I also shared how to make them with flaxseed tortillas, which was my paleo-ish version of something that tasted more like a corn tortilla. And in fact, those paleo tortillas, they bake up into a tortilla chip that tastes quite authentic and tastes a lot like corn. But these days, I am avoiding all of those things. I have noticed that I was having lots of issues with nuts and seeds and overdoing them and still dealing with the consequences of oxalate overload. These days, I tend to serve these with some easy egg wraps that you can make and whip them up at the last minute before dinner. And I have recipes for those on the blog. You can also check out the video. If you're pinched for time, you can make this on the higher heat setting of your crock pot, but you're still gonna need about 5 hours. And again, this will depend on your slow cooker. These days, I do make the meat with a spice blend. We don't really have issues with spices at my house, and the rest of my family prefers it that way. And because you're using this slow cooking method, the spices are slowly infusing into the meat, and it just makes it all so delicious that I just make it that way for everybody. I like to mix up a spice blend, and I have the recipe for that on the blog. But that spice blend uses salt, black pepper, cumin, which gives that authentic Mexican flavor. In this case, to add a little bit of smoky spiciness, I like to add some spicy smoked paprika. Here in Spain, it's quite common, and I use a spicy pimentón de la vera, which is a type of smoked paprika that is often used in chorizo. And I showed you on the blog how you can make and cure your own chorizo that is the authentic Spanish tasting chorizo. I also use dried garlic powder and onion powder. You can use either a powder or dried onion that's granulated, whatever you happen to have on hand. If you prefer, you can also just slice up thinly some onions and add some garlic cloves to your slow cooker, and that will also work. But in this case, I like to be able to make the spice blend ahead of time. It just makes it very convenient. You want to completely coat the meat and then throw it into your slow cooker. Once I have completely covered the meat with the spice rub, I then like to cover it with the juice of 1 lemon. Adding liquid is optional. In this case, it's very little liquid. It's just the lemon. I think the acidity can help balance out the flavors. It might help tenderize the meat. And it just keeps it nice and moist until it starts to release its own juices. You will notice that this will shrink up as it cooks, and it will release a lot of liquid. And that liquid is delicious. You can spoon it over the finished carnitas, or you can drink it as a broth. And if you are saving leftovers in the fridge, I like to save them with the liquid over top. That helps to conserve it better. But you will notice that that liquid will separate into 2 layers. And the top layer is going to be the fat, which is basically just lard. And you can scoop that off and use that for crisping up your next round of carnitas. And you will notice that that liquid will just solidify into a really thick gelatin. And that just shows you how nutrient dense this liquid is. So you don't want to throw it away. It's perfect for your hair, your nails, and it's just delicious. One of the great things about this recipe is that it is so versatile. While I like to serve them as carnitas, I crisp them up and then wrap them in the egg wraps, maybe with some guacamole or some Greek yogurt or sour cream. But the leftover meat can be used in so many different ways. It's delicious on pizza. You can serve it atop a salad with some sour cream, some cilantro dressing and with lime. I used to do that all the time, make a sort of taco salad, but with carnitas meat instead. You can serve it as like a pulled pork sandwich. There are just so many delicious ways to use the leftovers. But you can also cover it up or vacuum seal it and stick it in the freezer, and it freezes wonderfully. To use the frozen carnitas, you are going to want to think about it the night before, and the best way is to thaw it out in the fridge overnight. Once you're ready to serve them and you want to crisp them up, there are several ways to do this. You can use a broiler, especially if you have a lot and you're serving a lot of people and you need to broil a lot at once. You can stick them in a broiler. I like to cover it with a layer of melted fat, like melted lard is great. I take a pastry brush and just brush a little bit over the top, and that just helps get it nice and evenly browned. You stick it under the broiler, but you have to keep a really close eye on it and just make sure that you don't burn the meat. You want it to get nice and golden, brown, and crispy, but you don't want it to burn or get overly dry. So you're definitely going to want to preheat that broiler, get it nice and hot before you start. What I generally do, because I'm generally just making it for the 3 of us at home, I use a cast iron skillet. The thing I like about a cast iron skillet is that you can really carefully control how you crisp this up. You can make sure that it's even. You can flip it or not depending on how crispy you want it. If you want all over crispiness, you're going to want to flip it and use a thin layer. Again, you are going to want to make sure that that cast iron skillet is preheated. Not only does that help ensure that you can brown it quickly enough so that the meat doesn't dry out, but it also helps ensure that the meat won't stick to the skillet. I like to take a little bit of lard and melt it in the skillet and then press the meat in an even layer over the top. You want it to stay there without touching it too much because you want to make sure that it forms that crusty coat on the bottom. You can peel up on the edges a little bit, take a look, make sure that it doesn't burn. And once you're happy with the way it's looking, flip it over. The rest of my family likes it nice and crispy, so I generally will fry both sides. I quite like it both ways. And in fact, I even like it just fresh from the slow cooker, nice and tender and moist. So this again will depend on the way you prefer it. Try it out, see how you like it best, and then make it that way. If you're going to be making less than the amount that I specified on the blog, again, I was using a really large amount of meat. You're also going to want to cut the amount of the spice mix that you use to coat it in half, or depending on how big the cut of meat is, you're going to want to cut down the recipe for the spice rub in an equivalent ratio, because you don't want the meat to be overly salty. While you want it to have this great flavor that the salt and the spices give the meat, if you go overboard, you cannot remove that salt. Once your meat is crisped up, you are ready to serve it. Again, I serve it with my easy egg wraps, but you can use any sort of tortilla or serve it again over pizza or salads or however, or just eat the meat plain as is. It's really delicious. Again, this is one of our family favorites, and I really hope that you enjoy it as much as we do. We make this quite often, and my son really loves it. If you like this recipe, I hope you will give it a thumbs up, and I would love for you to subscribe to get notifications for new recipes. Until next time.